Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Evan J. Lawson here. I'm talking about something that has been on my mind this week with the 2020 US election that has just occurred. American culture seems to be everywhere, and in Australia we cannot escape it. So this week I am talking about classical music and culture in general from the United States. In my video about Australian classical music, I spoke a lot about how there isn't really a huge amount to really report on before the 20th century. And the United States is kind of similar. There's very sort of similar trends in both musical histories. So you have European salon traditions as well as orchestra and opera traditions that come to the settler cultures in the United States, same as in Australia. There is, however, one composer I really love from the late 19th century, early 20th century in the United States, and that is Charles Ives, probably considered the sort of grandfather of American music. He wrote these wild, huge orchestral works that sound like they should have been written in the 1950s, but they were written in like the 1890s and the 1910s. They're really, really interesting. He'll do things like have a hymn playing at the same time as a brass band off stage, or he'll have two different tunes playing in different keys, so they kind of merge together and clash together at the same time. He did a lot of very revolutionary new steps in music that really didn't kick off around the world until modernism many decades later. So he's definitely a composer to look into. He's also kind of an enigmatic American composer because he was an insurance salesman and he did that for most of his life and was quite rich. So he had the resources to write this like weird, wild avant-garde music because he had no monetary constraints on his work and life. One of the other really important trends in American musical life is, of course, the development of jazz music, ragtime music, and the African American tradition of spiritual singing, and their musical culture in general, which has, of course, been hugely influential on mass culture and the worldwide dominance of American culture around our time. There are some really exceptionally difficult. So their depiction of the African American experience, their depiction of jazz music and ragtime music in their classical music is really, really interesting and served as a basis for the integration of African American culture into the broader United States of America culture at the time. Of course, the history of jazz is its own kind of thing altogether, and it's its own art form separate to classical music, but it has been hugely influential on classical music, of course, especially in the modernist periods in the 1920s and the 1930s, where jazz was exceptionally popular worldwide, and its influence was seen on composers from Europe, the United States, everywhere. So that in itself is its own kind of investigation, but the history of jazz and its dominance as a popular art form up until the 1950s and the 1960s, then of course started to become more of a niche art form. Similar in a way, one could say about classical music. They both have kind of similar trends in that they are now kind of niche interests for people. They're not necessarily the dominant musical or artistic culture of society at the moment. With that in mind, the other really influential aspect of American musical culture is the development of the mass media. So in the 1920s, the radio becomes a really dominant part of culture and media information giving. So most people owned a radio, most people started to tune in for the news. I think a good example is like President Roosevelt's fireside chats that he would have every week. You know, it was spoken that every single person in the country would sit down and listen to the president talk about what was happening that week. And so similar trends happened in music where people would have their particular shows that they would tune into every single week. And music and culture was distributed in a new way that went across cities, it went across borders, and of course became what we would now call mass culture. That steadily grew into influencing the way that film developed, and film soon became another mass cultural icon as well. The 1930s in the United States, and of course that grew to like worldwide dominance by the 1940s and 50s. So with that in mind, there's some really interesting and really amazing composers that fit into those sort of trends and times. People like Irving Berlin, Cole Porter, George Gershwin, Jerome Kern, who were all well known as songwriters, strongly influenced by African American music making and jazz, but also strongly influenced by immigrant cultures, particularly Jewish music. George Gershwin is really important to talk about because of his popular songs from musicals and Tin Pan Alley pop hits that he wrote during the 1920s and 30s, but also because he wrote huge amounts of popular classical music, probably most notably his Rhapsody in Blue, which is arguably the most recognizable American classical music piece. But as I've spoken about in my Beginner's Guide to Opera, Gershwin is really important for his work Porgy and Bess. This is an important work because it was an early American opera that became internationally recognizable and successful. It had huge musical hits from the opera, which crossed over into pop music and jazz, and so it's a great example of music that was written during this time of mass culture and mass media. But also, it was an opera that depicted the African American experience in the United States. Now, there are times where it certainly suggests minstrelsy and it is not the most authentic depiction. However, I think it is still really important to look at because it's incredibly well written. The libretto is really beautiful and the text is really well written, as well as the music. But also, it does give a emotional depth to the characters who are, of course, African American, which we had never really seen in the opera world prior to then. So I think it is an important work for that reason. Other aspects to mass culture that are really important, as I said, is the film world, and film scoring has probably become the most dominant aspect of American musical culture. Composers like John Williams, Elmer Bernstein, Bernard Herman, Danny Elfman are all really recognizable names and have written some of the most recognizable music of the past 50 years. The Psycho scene, the theme from Star Wars, the theme from Indiana Jones, all of these sort of pieces are really recognizable, and many people would hum those when they were asked to sing an orchestral piece of music. So they're definitely composers worth researching, looking into, and listening to. I would also have a little addition to that list, and it would be some of the composers in the 1940s who wrote film scores. A good example is Franz Waxman, who immigrated to the United States as they escaped either the Russian communist regime or the German Nazi regime. And a lot of these imigre musicians created incredible film scores and contributed to the American musical culture in a way that I think is rarely recognized and should be championed where possible. So listen to something like Sunset Boulevard. The score to that by Franz Waxman is really amazing. After the Second World War, modernism really creeps into the United States musical aesthetic. Of course, modernism was around before the war, but you do see a really large push towards modernist tendencies with the arrival of these immigrant composers, most notably Igor Stravinsky and Arnold Schoenberg, who both moved to the United States and both lived in Hollywood. Schoenberg famously lived quite close to George Gershwin, and so there are photos of the two of them playing tennis, and they were quite good friends. And so when you're thinking about the history of music and the history of musical trends, which I've spoken about in other videos about Schoenberg and about the history of orchestral music, is that you have in the 20th century these two kind of titular personalities of Igor Stravinsky, who was very much supporting neoclassicism and music that was generally more diatonic and tonal and used key signatures, and that was perhaps more driven by jazz music and irregular rhythms, but still creating a more structured, expectant kind of musical language. And then the other hand, you had Schoenberg, who was about throwing a lot of that tradition out of the window, recreating systems and bringing in entirely new systems, often that created music that was completely unexpected and completely new, that sounded to be quite dissonant and quite difficult to listen to. There is, of course, this other way in music, which is this sort of popular music approach of people like George Gershwin, which have more influences from folk music and popular music and mass culture. And of course, I think it's really interesting noting that Gershwin knew Schoenberg, because there's often a view that these people were antitheses, that's a word, I don't even know, antitheses to each other, when in actual fact they knew each other. They listened to each other's music. They, engaged with each other. And there's a lot of documented evidence about the influence of Alban Berg's Wozzeck on Porgy and Bess, for instance. So Wozzeck, a huge symbol of modernist 20th century avant-garde music, and Porgy and Bess, something that's viewed on often as being a little bit more perhaps mainstream, but there is really strong influences of Wozzeck on Porgy and Bess, and I don't think that cannot be denied, that mass culture and popular music in America is viewed in a very different way than it probably did at the time in Europe, and so I think this divide of high and low art is really exemplified in the United States, and especially in this 1920s and 30s mass culture period. The post-war time brings in composers that are just as influenced and become even more influential, people like Leonard Bernstein, Elliot Carter, Aaron Copland, and they're all really interesting composers to mention because they become more influential or influenced from different styles, particularly jazz, particularly serialist techniques of Arnold Schoenberg. Elliot Carter is probably the most well-known of that trend. He wrote really complex, really amazing, mind-blowingly complex and sophisticated music. I'd strongly recommend you listen to his symphony, I think it is, for 2 orchestras. Leonard Bernstein, of course, is hugely popular for his musical West Side Story, and I think he's an important trend to mention because he's trying to bring in a lot of these musical techniques of serialism from Schoenberg and the kind of rhythmic complexity of Igor Stravinsky into more popular music trends in the musical theatre and in pop songs. So, of course, in West Side Story, his operetta Candide is an incredible example of American musical vernacular meeting European humor, like a satire of European musical trends. And then his other large-scale work, Mass, which, if you don't know it, look it up. It's not the greatest piece of music, but it is a really interesting example of like rock music, pop opera, classical music, serialist music, all coming together in this weird, like hippy-dippy 1970s kind of extravaganza that Bernstein put on. Bernstein, of course, was like one of the greatest conductors of all time, so he is really important simply as a champion of classical music in the 20th century. Aaron Copland is also an interesting one to talk about because film scores were quite important to him and influential in his career, though not a lot of people realize that. A lot of his early successes came from theatre and film score writing, and he probably single-handedly created the American sound, like this idea that we have now of American music being this kind of like sparse cowboy kind of atmosphere, sparse, beautiful soundscapes, or these like fast hoedown music, the music you'd think of about cowboys. That is all Aaron Copland. And so his ballet Rodeo, of course, Appalachian Spring, his Third Symphony, all worth listening to. Another composer of this post-war modernist time that I strongly recommend is Samuel Barber. He, I think, is important for many reasons. He wrote really beautiful music that has at its core tonality, but there is an angularity and a sophistication there that does something different to what Bernstein, Copland, and Carter were doing. I also think it's really important to talk about Barber because he was pretty much, I think, an openly gay man. His partner was the Italian composer Giancarlo Menotti, who also wrote a lot of the librettos for his operas. I think that's really important to note because there was often a trend in American music making of the time. Jerome, Leonard Bernstein, Aaron Copland, these gay composers who who rose to like national prominence and were recognizable in the mass culture, but grappled with their sexuality, and it was sort of like an unspoken thing. People knew about it, but it wasn't necessarily documented. So Barber, I think, is important because he led a pretty open life with his partner. I think it's worth noting that he really led a path for queer identifying people later in the century to be able to express themselves creatively and be known internationally and nationally in the mass media culture. There is also another trend of this sort of post-war time, which I kind of call like a reactionary avant-garde. John Cage is, of course, the most recognizable of this sort of trend, and it's really kind of like high modernism. Cage is so important, and I think probably, arguably, one of the most influential composers of all time, because he basically frees the listener to listen to anything, like the bashing of this hammer out my window, as being music. Anything can be music. Like me picking up this water bottle and like doing that is music. And I think John Cage, it's really interesting to research his pieces because, of course, 4 minutes 33 is his most famous, 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. But also he's famous for having pieces where like, I'll link a video like in the description about like picking up a radio and just turning the knobs and then throwing the radio in a bath of water. Like he does all of these really kind of like humorous moments, but also he's making commentary on the pretension of classical music, especially in the 1950s, which became so much like, it was almost like as if they were trying to fight and win the Cold War themselves by writing, you know, serialist sonatas and, you know, these really esoteric, hard to listen to pieces. Cage kind of fights that and says, well, no, you can just roll a dice and that will create complexity. You can just pick up a whole lot of scores that I've written and throw them on the ground, and that will determine the order of the piece. I will write a lecture about nothingness, where the person talks about nothingness for 30 minutes, and that is as wonderful as a Beethoven symphony. So I think Cage is incredibly important. We still don't really understand his legacy, and he covered so many different areas of music making and music philosophy and thinking that you just can't talk about American music without acknowledging that Cage is hugely influential on the practice of music since the end of the Cold War. I kind of think of Cage in a similar way to people thinking about Satie, the famous French composer in the 1920s and 30s, who was really reacting against Wagnerism and Debussy in a way, like this kind of obsession that a lot of composers had in the early 20th century for like grand, large-scale things. Satie then wrote, of course, his famous Gymnopedes series of short, simple, beautiful, repetitive piano music, and it became hugely influential on the French composers Les Six, who were all about popular music and writing music that was perhaps less dramatic and less ostentatious and more functional or fun or about the day-to-day life. It was certainly more modernist and about mechanical things rather than sumptuous romanticism. I think of Cage in a similar way to the minimalist composers. He was opened the door for composers like Steve Reich, Philip Glass, and John Adams, who were able to go back to kind of basic musical principles in the foundation and development of minimalist music. So if you don't know those composers or the term minimalism, it's basically similar like in visual art, where you have a trend of art that might just be very simplistic structures and forms. It's the same sort of thing in music. So you take very small structures, very small musical fragments, and create large repetitive structures with them. And through those structures, through repeating a lot of this material, music can become quite transformative, quite meditational. A work like Einstein on the Beach by Philip Glass is incredibly abstract. It has this rhythmic drive to it, which just keeps you completely engaged and hypnotized throughout the whole thing. I think John Adams is an interesting one to talk about in this context because he uses minimalism a lot, but he introduces a lot of other traditions from classical music into his music. So Debussy is a huge influence. Even Wagner is there. Opera is, of course, a huge part of his output. So I think John Adams is interesting because, again, he's like a transitional figure. What Adams does is he kind of pushes it into a new realm and says what you can do with minimalism is not necessarily just what Philip Glass and Steve Reich did in the early days, and of course other composers like Terry Riley, etc., where you have these very sort of rigid small cells that are repeated constantly. He brings in other influences and ways of writing and creating music, which open the door for this period in American music since the end of the Cold War, which has been much more open and much more fluid, I would say, where you get composers who are perhaps more on the John Cage side of things, of like performance art-based music, which is incredibly influential in American musical culture. You have composers that fit in the minimalist mold. You have composers that fit in the more modernist serial mold. So I think John Adams is a great example of where American music has sort of traveled to and where it is now, where it is quite open and accepting. It is generally, in my experience, more tonal, I would say, than European music on the whole. But that's not to say that that is the only thing going on. I think there's just a lot of that kind of way of music making, and it seems to be that type of music is what is taught in the universities. A lot of students are taught through the lens of American composers like Glass and Adams, which have a much more of a tonal bent than, say, the European Avant-Guard or a composer like Elliot. Of course, those composers are taught and covered, but there just seems to be a more of a trend towards tonal music. Again, perhaps the influence of mass media in film music, where tonality is more common and more prevalent, perhaps that is why we tend to see a lot more tonal music coming from the United States. I don't know, but there's certainly other composers that are not writing tonal music, and of course there's certainly pop music and film scores that are not at all tonal as well. For people that don't know what I'm talking about tonal music, it's music that's in like a key signature and uses structures and forms that are derived from 17th and 18th century European music traditions. So, Lady Gaga writes tonal music, for instance. Aaron Copland at times writes tonal music. It's a very broad term, and it sometimes can be used to be a derogatory thing. It's just the way that the musical notes are structured. And it's in a way where it's more functional to open and free harmonies, where musical structures are less about the hierarchy and function of notes and the stress and release of notes. It's perhaps in a composer like Elliot, that kind of relationship is different, or the way that those notes are arranged is in an attempt to subjugate traditional forms and structures of hierarchical relationships in tones. The other really influential aspect of American music I would like to talk about is musical theatre. It's very influential in my life, something I love, but it's also very influential on mass culture in general. I think a lot of people, if you were, say, sing me a song from that was written by an American person, there would be a lot of songs that would be from musicals. I think, shows like Oklahoma, for instance, have been hugely influential on the mass culture and have permeated around the world. I think also in this conversation about musicals, it's worth noting again Gershwin, and I think Gershwin really is one of the great American composers in this respect, because he goes across so many different lines. He wrote
piano concertos, he wrote piano sonatas, he also wrote pop songs, and he also wrote musicals, and he wrote an opera.
So I think Gershwin is a really interesting composer to look into from that respect, because he transformed the way that the musical was and operated from the 1920s and the 1930s into the real strong musical tradition that was born, musical theatre tradition that is, in the 1940s and 50s, with primarily Rodgers&Hammerstein. I think it's also worth noting, of course, Stephen Sondheim, probably one of the most successful composers of our time. He's written incredibly complex and beautiful music. He's a great example of a composer who uses tonality, but also integrates other aspects outside of traditional tonal structures. He also has a very rich and interesting rhythmic language, which I strongly suggest composers to look, and anyone, singers as well, but especially composers who are looking to improve their vocal writing, to look at Stephen Sondheim, the way he sets the text, the way he writes the text, the sort of texts that he chooses create really excellent musical structures that tell the story as well as being really beautiful and intriguing. So that is my little summation of musical trends and ideas from the United States in the 20th century. I think it's really interesting looking at play at the moment, especially in the current political climate, and kind of talk about what might be next for American music making, because we've got to say that there is certainly a cultural decline that is taking place in the United States. There is, of course, still some amazing stuff being created, and I think the rich world of classical music and musical theatre and opera making in America is really amazing. And I think American opera at the moment is going through a complete renaissance. There seems to be American operas being premiered all the time, everywhere, by big companies, small companies. Some works are more mainstream, and some are more really avant-garde, and like there's just so much incredible opera being done. But you look at something like Hollywood film, I don't feel that there's a huge amount of really like incredible Hollywood films being created. I think Hollywood is kind of on decline. We're seeing like the rise of these like huge superhero epic films, which, do they really challenge and push society in a different way? Or really is it just there as a mass culture to be consumed and to be spent money on and make money with? A lot of these projects seem to want to embrace markets that are non-English speaking. So of course, the quality of those films is going to be affected by that. In addition to that, the music gets less budget, less time. It has to be churned out really quick. I have a deep respect for film score writers. I think it's like the hardest job. You have to write things so quickly, and it's just getting harder and harder. You need to just produce music at such an extraordinarily fast rate that I think in a way we've gotten to this point where quality is not necessarily deemed to be the most important factor. It's viability economically. It's not to say that there's incredibly talented people doing this work and their work is good. I just think I'd love to see more films being made where all of the elements of the film, and especially, of course, the thing I'm interested in mostly is the music, are given the opportunity to really develop and grow. American musical theatre is, of course, in a similar position where it's been on the decline probably since the end of the Cold War. However, there's, of course, still great work being done. A piece like Hamilton is incredible and really influential and really important and really wonderful that it's made its way around the world. But I think go back 40, 50 years, those sort of pieces were being made all the time, and we were seeing a lot of that American culture being created that was commentary and groundbreaking and beautiful and interesting and doing all of these things. Well, now we have a tendency to see only a handful of really remarkable pieces make their way through because the financial limitations are so hard. It costs so much money to do films, it costs so much money to do mainstream musical theatre, and of course it costs a huge amount of money to do opera and orchestras, but somehow opera seems to be flourishing, as I said, at the moment. So that gives me a lot of hope. Aside from the composers that I've listed, I'll also name some other people down below, some lesser known, perhaps American composers too. So yeah, dive on in and have a listen to some new American music that you might not have heard before. And I will speak to you guys in my next video. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share if you would like. Let me know what you think. Let me know what pieces you listen to. And I'll see you next time.